Hello my friends, in this video we learn about the theoretical framework for vibrational astrology. This video is also the sixth video in a series of videos about evidence-based practice versus science, but you can watch this video independently of that series. And a theoretical framework is especially important in an evidence-based practice. The reason why a theoretical framework is important is that it gives a basis, it gives a foundation, it gives a framework for all of the details that are in your theories. So in vibrational astrology or any other form of astrology, whether it's Vedic or Hellenistic, etc., there are rules, lots and lots of rules. Planet is in the sign ruled by that planet, like Mercury's in Virgo, it's in this house, etc. You have certain aspects of predictive methods. There are tons and tons of rules. Do those individual rules hold together? Is there some kind of logic? Is there some kind of systematic connection? Is there some kind of context in which all of these things exist? Or do some of the rules tend to be independent, disparate things that you just memorize for no particular reason? Now, if there is a weak theoretical framework, in other words, there isn't something holding together all of these rules, well, the rules may still be true. They just might be correct, even though there's no framework, there's no system, there's a weak system for holding it all together. That's not you might say, a deal breaker. Doesn't mean that the rules are wrong. If, on the other hand, there is a solid theoretical framework, then that strengthens our confidence in the ideas. And in modern evidence-based practices, it's all about confidence. How confident are we in a particular evidence? So if we say that Aries is pioneering, Taurus is stubborn, Gemini is curious, whatever, and by the way, those are not exactly the definitions that we use in vibrational astrology, but those are the ideas for those signs in other forms of astrology. If we have these ideas and there's a theory behind it, and behind the specific theory there's this overall framework and context in which everything exists, then we have more confidence in those ideas, because it's just common sense, because we have some reason to understand why they would be true and how it all fits together. So it strengthens our confidence. And in vibrational astrology, we are fortunate to have a very comprehensive and complete theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework is a lot of assumptions, but those assumptions and those premises are they're also informed by the rules. So the rules fit within that framework, and they should confirm the framework. I talked about that at the end of the previous video. Let's jump into this framework, and we also in the previous video discussed the first in a series of items of basic rules of this theoretical framework, which is that in vibrational astrology, number one, we have the premise, the assumption that astrological variables produce measurable effects. Measurable effects is exactly what it sounds like. A measurable effect means something you can measure. So, for example, suppose somebody is hungry, suppose somebody's angry, suppose somebody's happy. It can be difficult to measure happiness on a scale. How do you measure, any feeling? It's difficult. You can have an operational definition of it. You can have people give a score for it. So there are ways to measure things that are not concrete, but it's more difficult. So things can exist. You can be hungry, you can be happy, whatever it is. Maybe nobody has measured it. Maybe we're not able to find clear cause and effect. Of course, for hunger, it's pretty straightforward. If you haven't eaten in a long time, you're likely to be hungry. So, but for happiness, the triggers for happiness might be more complicated. So something can be true and not necessarily scientifically verified or clearly observed in a repeatable way. But in vibrational astrology, we believe that the effects of these astrological variables, again, variable means anything that varies, as the planets form different aspects and other planetary configurations, there are effects, they're measurable, and we can study them. Why do we have this premise? Because we've done the research and it shows that it's true. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this is the book published in early 2022, The Astrology of Bipolar Disorder, a scientific breakthrough that explains in detail those findings. Okay, now I'm going to go into more of the theoretical framework for vibrational astrology. This theoretical framework is something that we can explore, discuss, and study for an entire course. I'm going to summarize some very fundamental principles right here so that you have heard them, so you get the concept, so you get the feeling for what this theoretical framework is. You're not going to be able to understand every detail, or probably not, if you haven't been exposed to these ideas before, but that's okay. I want you to get the feeling, the concept of the theoretical framework. It's very important. Excuse me. This theoretical framework is very important because it helps you appreciate and understand how the ideas in vibrational astrology work, what they show us, what they do not show us, and they just help you be a better vibrational astrologer because you understand what it's all about, where this comes from, and what it's meant to do. However, you do not need to understand every technical detail of the theoretical framework. You just have to have the basic idea. So we're going to go through this. Some of this is going to introduce probably some new information for most of you, and maybe a little overwhelming even, because a lot of new terminology. That's okay. Don't worry about it. You'll get the basic concept. The first thing is dimension reduction. Okay. I told you, there might be some terms you're not familiar with. Don't worry about it. You'll get the basic idea. Dimension reduction is important in how astrology works. Okay, so that is one of the premises of vibrational astrology. In vibrational astrology, we have a very clear idea of why astrology works. A lot of times people just say, well, we don't know why astrology works. Well, in vibrational astrology, we have a clear explanation for why astrology works. Do we know that that explanation is correct? No, we don't know, but that's what a theoretical framework is often about. It sets the principles, the concepts, the assumptions, the premises upon which the specific research is conducted, and upon which the consultations are done, and upon which we build our interpretations, and it works. So the reason we have this theoretical framework is that it works. It helps us make discoveries. It helps us understand what we're doing. It helps us give better consultations. So the evidence for the theoretical framework is that by building from this theoretical framework, we are having success in our research, success in our consultations. So, to get back to this second concept in the theoretical framework for vibrational astrology, dimension reduction is one of the principles that makes astrology work. Now, to understand what dimension reduction is, let's build this up step by step. You all know about Albert Einstein, and you all know that he has a theory of relativity. In Einstein's theory of relativity, he states, or that we should say the theory of relativity states, that space consists of three dimensions: height, width, and depth. Okay, no argument about that. That's straightforward. And there is something called time. Great. We all know there's time. So far, so good. The bizarre idea in our theory of relativity is that space and time are part of one thing. That time is a fourth dimension. So there's something called a time-space continuum. So that time and space are not separate. How bizarre is that? So we think of time as one thing, space is another thing. So to us they seem separate, but to the theory of relativity, they are intimately connected. In fact, they're so connected that they are part of one phenomenon. Now, why does the theory of relativity have this bizarre idea that time and space is like one thing? Because the formulas used to describe the behavior of subatomic particles and, well, actually with relativity, it has more to do with how light bends as it moves around objects. Behavior of certain things are predicted by these formulas, and the formulas lay out space as just another column that goes along with height, width, and depth. So the formulas just treat space as if it's another part of space. Did I say that right? They treat time as if it's just another part of space. So time-space continuum. Okay. Maybe I'm talking too much about this. Simple idea, Einstein merges time with space. That's it. Okay. Now, in recent decades, scientists have gone even further with this. Not only is this kind of dimensions of reality that are strange to humans with our common sense, that the three dimensions of space and dimension of time are intimately part of one thing. So there's some weird thing going on with the nature of reality, weird from the point of view of human beings, that not only that, there are other weird things going on, such as that there are actually more than four dimensions. There's height, width, depth, and time, and there are other dimensions. Well, what are these other dimensions? We cannot describe them. We don't have direct access to them as human beings. But when these other dimensions are put into the formulas, they help predict the behavior of things. So if a formula works, we talked earlier about how physics especially is about mathematical modeling, how these mathematical formulas often do not make common sense. Excuse me. And that's the case here. So there's this idea of more than four dimensions. It's a basic idea that's used in a lot of areas of physics. You might have heard about superstring theory as one example of where this idea is used. We incorporate these ideas into vibrational astrology. So what we say in vibrational astrology is that there are more than four dimensions. It's true. Why do we agree with that idea? Because it becomes useful in understanding how astrology works. So, there are more than four dimensions. Well, where are they? They fold in on each other, is what the physicists say, and there's a process of dimension reduction. And actually, dimension reduction is something we're all familiar with. You know that there are basketballs, there are baseballs, there are round balls that we play with, beach balls. A ball is round, it's circular. That's a three-dimension circularity. We also have circularity on a piece of paper or on a computer screen. It's a circle. So you have a circle in 2 dimensions, you have a circle in 3 dimensions, right? So there's something called circularity that exists in 3 dimensions as a ball, or the geometric term for it is a sphere. And there is circularity in 2 dimensions, which is a circle. So what happens is there's a process of dimension reduction that goes on in nature where spheres collapse into circles, for example. Okay? This is incredibly consistent with what we say in astrology. Because in astrology, as I discussed in the previous videos in this series, we collapse the sky into circles. How incredibly consistent is it that the ancient knowledge of astrology agrees with some of the latest findings in science? That the sphere of the sky, the celestial sphere, we can think of everything in the sky as being like on a circle around us. In fact, even though they are not, the fixed stars, are much farther away than planets, and they're all different distances. In astronomy, we do a lot of calculations, making believe everything is in a sphere around us, and the calculations work. Anyway, you take the whole sky, all of space, all around us, as a sphere, collapse it into a circle. And that actually is what nature is doing. That's why there are these 5 great circles that I described in earlier videos in this series, that the ecliptic plane, the celestial equator, the celestial horizon, the meridian plane, and the prime vertical. Those 5 great circles are 5 ways that the entire sky collapses. So, do you have it? What we're saying is that there are more than 4 dimensions. These other dimensions are like spiritual realities or higher planes of existence or something. However you want to think of it, there are these other dimensions, and there's a process of dimension reduction where they collapse. The sky, the power of the sky, a kind of force, a kind of, you start using that word vibration, frequencies in the sky, also they exist and in a sphere, and they also collapse onto these great circles. And that's why the great circles are important, as has always been said in astrology, that we can put the planets on the ecliptic plane. Why are we able to project the planets onto the ecliptic plane? Which, if you're not familiar with that, you can watch the earlier videos in this series of videos on evidence-based practice. I think it's the previous one in this series, or the one before it, where I discuss what we do in astrology. We don't use the actual positions of planets. We project them onto the ecliptic plane. And this works. We're giving a theoretical basis. We're giving a framework for understanding this. This works because that ecliptic plane acts like a vibrating string. It condenses into itself everything in the sky. So these are just abstract concepts. They're very abstract, but they do give a sense of, you might say, security, or a sense that we're not just picking things randomly and doing weird things, that there's some reason for it. Okay, so dimension reduction is a fundamental principle in some areas of physics, and it's a basis for why astrology works. As I said, in vibrational astrology, we do have a detailed, clear theoretical framework for why astrology works, and that's maybe a little bit surprising because we don't have that in most other fields of astrology. Now, point number 3, the Ascendant. We all know about the Ascendant, your rising sign. We all know about the tropical zodiac and that there's a Zero Aries point. We all know about the midheaven, the 10th house cusp. And you're probably familiar with the Vertex, which is a relatively new idea introduced in the 20th century into astrology. I mean, maybe people talked about it earlier, but I'm not aware of it. And it was rediscovered or, introduced without any previous information about it in the 20th century by a fellow named Edward Jondro, who was a colleague and friend of, I can't think of his name right now. Well, it's okay. Edward Jondro and Charles Jane. is the person I'm thinking of. Anyway, they introduced this idea of the vertex. Now, here's what is happening with these points, the ascendant, tropical, zero Aries, the midheaven, and the vertex. They are all intersection points of the great circles. Wow, this is incredibly elegant and beautiful. It's so systematic and clear that the force of the entire sky collapses onto great circles. Why? Because that's what nature does. Nature has all these dimensions, and they like to collapse down into lower dimensions. The sphere likes to collapse onto a great circle. Why? I don't know. It just does. You take two great circles, you can think of them almost like electric circuits, like these powerful circles that are in the sky. You're in the middle. A great circle means that you, or you could say the earth, is in the center. Any circle you can draw around yourself is a great circle. Where two great circles intersect is like two huge currents of the entire, that have the power of the entire sky connecting. Boom! It's like it's like a fireworks display or lightning bolt. Two currents connect, and they, in a sense, have the power of the whole sky. The amazing thing is that tropical, zero Aries and Libra, the ascendant and descendant, the MC and the IC, and the vertex and the anti-vertex are all created from the same exact phenomenon. A great circle intersecting with the ecliptic plane. So I've got them listed here 4 in a row. The intersection of the ecliptic plane with the celestial equator, that is tropical, zero Aries and Libra. That's what they are. You can call it the vernal equinox. You can call it whatever you want. We can also think of it as simply where the celestial equator intersects, in other words, connects, crosses the ecliptic plane. Similarly, there's the horizon plane. We talked about this in an earlier tutorial video. Where it intersects the ecliptic plane, that's your ascendant and descendant. We often say the ascendant is the point of that's east. Well, it's not necessarily due east. You know, it's more specifically and precisely, the ascendant is where the horizon plane, and by the way, the horizon plane is an abstract thing. It's not your visible plane. This tells us also that astrology is based on sacred geometry. It's a geometry of the heavens. It's a mathematical sacred geometry that's more pure and pristine than what we see. So here's a way in which vibrational astrology disagrees with some of the ancient systems. A lot of the ancient systems are putting huge emphasis on what you see with your eye. Well, I'm not saying that that's not important. Maybe it's important, but it's not fundamental to the basis of what astrology is. The basis of astrology comes from higher dimensions, not limited by what our eyes can see. It's coming from this more pure realm of what is existing in these higher dimensions on a purely geometric level. And sorry about that phone ringing. I just muted that. And so that's what the basis of astrology is. And we have a clear reason for understanding why the ascendant is so important. Why is the ascendant so important? It's important because it is this powerful point where all of this dimension reduction gets concentrated into a single point. So that's what, let me just do something real quick here. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, took care of that message. That's why these points are powerful. So our theoretical framework gives us a reason for understanding why these points are important. And a beautiful thing about theories, and the theories we can build based on this large framework for astrology, in other words, the theoretical framework, by understanding what's going on, it helps us it helps us figure out other things that work, why they would work, how they would work, etc. Okay, so this is part of the theoretical framework. It's going to inform how we understand astrology, how we apply it, and how we understand what astrology can do. Okay, next point. Okay, that was point number 3. Why the Ascendant, Tropical, Zero Aries, the Midheaven, and the Vertex. So we suspect the Vertex is equally important with the others, or maybe nearly as important, because it's the same thing as the others. Because we have this clear concept of how astrology works, it implies certain things, and from that we can see if it's true, and yes, we are finding it all fits together and it makes sense. It also helps explain a lot of other problems in astrology, as we will learn in future classes. Point number 4. Okay, point number 4, we understand why there are 12 zodiac signs. Point number 3 makes it clearer. Let's go back to point number 3, or point number 2, the process of dimension reduction. And the way that that dimension reduction works through the 5 great circles explains why these points are important. Okay, so we have that Zero Aries and Zero Libra are powerful points. You know, in a sense, they have the power of the entire sky. But why are there 12 sections of 30 degrees? That is not explained by our first 3 principles that we've described. Why does it happen that starting at tropical Zero Aries, there's a 30-degree section called Aries? At least astrologers believe there is. Is that true? Well, we do use zodiac signs in vibrational astrology. Do we have a way of understanding why the zodiac signs are there? As I said before, if we don't, it's okay. Things can be true and we may not have any way of understanding why they're true, but we get lucky again. We understand why there are tropical zodiac signs. And again, it's based in physics. So we're developing this very clear, comprehensive, totally integrated and logical and consistent theoretical framework where, again, it's the fundamental principles of how nature works. And here's what modern scientists tell us. They say that there are 3 fundamental properties of subatomic particles: charge, mass, and spin. So from these 3 things, charge, mass, and spin, we can describe everything about the basic components of the physical world. Well, later we're going to talk about how the physical world is not as physical as it seems, but to us humans, there's a stable physical world out there. And it's built from these components that have 3 properties. One of them is spin. Now this spin, we all know what the word spin means. It means like twirling round and round. The spin at the subatomic level is not understood as a physical spin, like something's actually going round and round, but it's a force that's called angular momentum. So it's a circulating force. Well, if there's a circulating force, our logic tells us there must be something causing that circulating force. And again, in science, we often use formulas because they work, but they make no sense. I mean, there's no common sense to them. So there's this circulating force, but nobody can pinpoint what's causing it. So we have the force, this angular momentum. So there's angular momentum, like a swirling force. Now here's what we do in this 4th part of the theoretical framework. Excuse me. We say, yes, good, cool. There's this thing called angular momentum. And we introduce a new idea. This is done all the time to explain things. So we introduce an additional idea that's not part of physics. What we propose is that in this spin, in this angular momentum, embedded in it are prime number sequences and Fibonacci sequences. They're called Paisano periods. They're They're a form of Fibonacci sequences, or it's like rhythms within Fibonacci sequences. For now, we'll just call it the Fibonacci sequence. That the Fibonacci sequence, and there are patterns to prime numbers. Those patterns of prime numbers, and the patterns of these things called Paisano periods, which are, you can think of them as rhythms within the Fibonacci sequence, they are embedded in spin. So a fourth part of our theoretical framework for vibrational astrology is that Fibonacci numbers and prime numbers are embedded in spin. Now again, all this is very abstract, and it's not critically important that you totally understand it. And I have dozens of tutorial videos on how these numbers create the zodiac. So it's amazing that we understand this in detail. Now, the reason why this is important for you as a practicing astrologer is not that you necessarily need to understand all of the details of how these number sequences create the zodiac, but what all that's really important for us right now is the idea that there's a reason for this, and it's created from number, and it's created from sacred geometry and frequencies and patterns within the numbers. That's where the zodiac comes from. It becomes very, very important for us because, let me give you one example, and then we're going to take a stopping point here. We'll continue the rest of this theoretical framework in another video because we're already at a half hour. But it's important, for example, for this reason. Aries is associated with the beginning of spring, right? Aries is spring, and then Taurus, is like the blooming of flowers in springtime and so on. And so we have this idea that the zodiac is seasons. It's basically like a cosmic seasons. It's kind of a pretty idea, but there's some big problems with it. First of all, if you're in the southern hemisphere, Aries is not the beginning of spring, it's the beginning of autumn, so this only works for half the world. Second of all, seasons are not all nice and pretty like that, even in the northern hemisphere. Some places have wet seasons and dry seasons, and they don't really have as clear a demarcation of spring and so on. So it's kind of a very limited analogy. And the problems that we have with trying to call the zodiac signs seasonal, all those problems are removed by the theoretical framework we use in vibrational astrology, because the zodiac signs are not seasonal. Forget that idea. Not directly. What they are is they are created from dimension reduction and spin, and the way that numbers are embedded in spin. That's what creates the zodiac signs. It's pure, sacred geometry and the foundations of existence. That's what's creating astrology. Okay? Now here's the interesting thing. Seasons, spring, summer, winter, autumn, they are created out of this sacred geometry that manifests as the earth spinning on its axis and revolving around the sun, which are physical manifestations of fundamental sacred geometry. So the seasons and the tropical zodiac signs are sisters, or you could call them brothers. They are sisters. They're both born out of the same thing, and their mother is sacred geometry. And like any two sisters, there are some things that seasons and the tropical signs have in common, and there's some things that are very, very, very different. In fact, they're so different in a lot of ways, they're almost more like cousins than sisters. Anyway, you get the idea. So there is a relationship between zodiac signs and the seasons in that they're both born out of the same thing. They have some similarities, but zodiac signs are not constrained to the limitations of seasons. So if seasons do certain things and zodiac signs do things differently, that's fine. That's fine. For example, Aries is Aries in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Zero Aries is the beginning of spring in the northern hemisphere. It's the beginning of autumn in the southern hemisphere. Not a problem. Not a problem at all, because they don't have to coincide. They're just born out of the same sacred geometry. Okay. So you're seeing how in vibrational astrology we have this theoretical framework in which lots of pieces of astrology all fit together very beautifully. So it's really just wonderful, because it gives us so much more confidence and understanding and insight into how we use astrology and how it functions. And as we'll see, everything in vibrational astrology, from the controlled research all the way to the consultations you do with your clients, they all reinforce and support each other. Okay, we are now at 36 minutes. Let's stop here. We'll continue with the fifth principle of the theoretical framework for vibrational astrology in the next video. Thank you very much, my friends. God bless. Namaste.